Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be talking about something. It's not going to be code. It's not going to be like the usual kind of videos I usually create. We're going to actually be reacting to a blog post that I was reading yesterday morning, and I really found it useful to share this blog post with you guys so that you can be able to actually see if what is in this blog post is true, and I'll also try as hard as I can to share my personal experiences based on this blog post. So the title of this video is JavaScript is Hard, and we're going to be reading this blog post and finding out why it's hard, and I'll also be sharing my personal experiences about the JavaScript programming language, and maybe I'll try as hard as I can to keep it real with you guys and basically share my personal experience of how I got to learn JavaScript. So let's get started. So the title of the post is Why Can't I Learn JavaScript? And it also has a subtitle of 4 reasons it's so damned hard. So right now, we see that for both newbie developers and veterans crossing over from another language, learning JavaScript is an uphill battle. Well, this is right. Don't be fooled by the lies. It takes time, effort, and monumental resilience on your part to push past its brutal starting gates and get to the point where you can build something of value. Yeah, this is of course right, but it's worth it. It's a powerful, flexible language that can make you a lot of money, which is right, and it's been and will continue to be a persistent fixture of the internet. So learning it of long-term value for you. So learning it is of long-term value for you and those that depend on you. Here are 4 of the most challenging stumbling blocks to learn JavaScript and how to overcome them. So right here, we actually see that it's very important to learn JavaScript. Being a developer in 2022, and let's say you're dealing with web, there's no way you can escape JavaScript. I mean, JavaScript is everywhere. JavaScript can write both front end and back end. You can even write mobile apps with React Native using JavaScript. So I can kind of relate to what the author of this post said. JavaScript takes a lot of time and effort for you to get to the point where you can comfortably build stuff with JavaScript. So let's look into the 4 reasons as to why JavaScript is hard according to the author, and I'll try as hard as I can to maybe share my experience. So the first reason is nightmare syntax. The first JavaScript hurdle you need to overcome is its nightmare syntax. Some of the languages are smothered in syntactic sugar and are elegantly constructed, so they are as humanly readable as possible. And then there is JavaScript. I come from a technical writing background, so to me JavaScript is like the world's worst run-on sentence. Bracket, bracket, comma, content, semicolon, semicolon. It's a damned challenge to read. So he also gives an example here. For example, this is an our function, and what it returns is if you can't easily, and then some stuff here that's actually confusing. If you can't easily and naturally read a language, then you are going to have a hell of a time learning it. Honestly speaking, I can really relate to this because coming from a background where I learned Python as my first programming language, I remember picking up JavaScript with all this complex syntax. Now you have to learn how to write JavaScript in ES5, and then you get to see an arrow function for the first time. I mean, it doesn't really make sense, but I think it's something that comes natural as you write more JavaScript. So how to overcome? All programming languages have this challenge, but JavaScript is extra special with the way it's constructed. It uses a lot of punctuation, so you have curly braces and then you have these parentheses, for example, like when you're writing a while loop or a for loop or an if statement, so which your brain is trained to understand as pauses in thoughts, emphasis, breaks, and so on, but they don't mean the same in JavaScript. So it's a jarring, confusing experience reading JavaScript for the first time. There is no way around this. You just have to get used to it. But knowing that just reading the code is part of the battle, can give you comfort. It's not you it's JS and it will take time. So honestly speaking, I can relate to this because having to experience JavaScript for the very first time, I had to deal with a lot of things that I wasn't really used to. For example, how you write functions and all these curly braces, semicolons. I think you can really know what I'm meaning. So I think what they are suggesting here is you just need to get used to it. You just need to write more JavaScript for it to start making sense in some way. I'm not kind of an expert because I've also not written JavaScript for more than 2 years, but I really think that the way to get used to the JavaScript syntax is basically writing more JavaScript. So right here, we can see an example of the code that we are actually having as an example here. So what you have is a simple snippet of code. So we have comments that can be multi-line, and then we have all this within this kind of hashtags. So these are code comments and section breaks. And then you have things like indentation to show separation in the code, which doesn't actually make sense because when you have these curly braces, they kind of determine that this is where an if statement begins from and this is where it actually ends, but then you still have to indent, which kind of confuses. But then let's go ahead and see. So one way I bridged this gap was to copy all the tutorial code into my IDE and add spaces, indentation, code comments, and so on to make it more legible. Obviously, because it's a tutorial, the code should have been written this way in the first place, but it's not. It never is. You have to do it yourself. People would think I was crazy and would laugh when they saw me in class formatting all the code samples. But honestly, this was the only way I could actually read this stuff. So according to the reader, he found it hard. The author, he found it hard to actually read code from tutorials. So he had to go an extra mile of formatting the code. But I really think getting to a level where you can really understand JavaScript is something that comes after a long period of time. I personally remember having to write a lot of JavaScript and having to actually reach to a point where I was almost giving up because everything wasn't seeming to make sense. So let's go ahead. Eventually your brain retrains itself to understand the punctuation differently, and you can actually read it, but you have to hang in there for quite some time until it becomes secondary nature. So just like you see here, the author is actually advising us to write more JavaScript as it's the only way we can get to understand its syntax well. Then the next one is, I'm not going to be able to swear in my video, so the next point is cluster code. Some languages force you to sensibly organize your code, but with JavaScript, anything goes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can relate to this because once you have the curly braces placed where they are supposed to be, there is no way you can innate your code, and you can pretty much write your code in any way you want. Often, lazy developers dump everything into a simple JavaScript file, which makes it a nightmare to read and understand. An impenetrable mess of spaghetti code. Then they kind of put a spaghetti picture right here. So how to overcome? I don't put up with this anymore and just move on to another tutorial. The internet is stuffed with getting started, learn to code in 10 minutes, boot camps, books, and so on. If you run into a tutorial that has code like this, dump it and move on to one that doesn't. He's actually right, because sometimes you may find that you cannot understand the code in a certain tutorial, but then moving on to another tutorial can kind of help you get to understand something better, as someone may write better code than in another video. So that's right, don't waste your time passing through spaghetti to find a single strand of meaning. I recommend that before you even begin a tutorial, look through its code and see how spaghetti-like it is. If it's a myth, then move on to the next one. But the problem with this is he doesn't put into consideration the fact that a beginner may want to learn from a coding tutorial. So some beginners are actually output oriented. For example, they may want to be having an app working and they may not care about the quality of code that the tutorial has. So point number 2 kind of doesn't really explain how hard JavaScript is, according to my opinion. Feel free to correct me down in the comment section. So another point, which is point number 3, is tutorials are made by experts. This is kind of wrong. Not everyone who makes a tutorial is actually an expert about the topic, and given the fact that it's YouTube, as long as someone understands something, they can create videos about it. I've actually created a lot of videos on this channel of topics I have very little ideas about, or things I don't know, and I just try to learn and then share with you guys, and I get to learn while doing it. So this point kind of has question marks around it, but let's go ahead and read it. So experts are the worst teachers. They don't know what it is to not know. If you know what I mean, and often do more damage than good. So the point is, some experts are actually good at teaching. I've actually learned a lot from channels that are big, channels that are by experts. So you cannot just come out and be like, all experts are not good teachers. There are experts that really know how to teach. For example, I actually one day subscribed to Front-End Masters, and honestly speaking, I learned a lot from people like Scott Moss, people who are experts in their field. They taught me like I did not know anything about JavaScript. By the end of their videos, of their tutorials, of their courses, I was really able to grasp the concept and be able to work on some real projects. So another thing is, actually, let's just continue with my first intro to JavaScript course had this one of the code samples. So I think this is like jQuery code where they're selecting a div called myDiv, and I think they are selecting it by the ID. Supposedly, according to the class notes, this is the most simplistic JavaScript code to understand. All it does is to scoop up a myDiv element. Yeah, I was actually right. So I tried to run the code locally and I can't. This keeps popping up, and code reference error, $sign is non-defined. JavaScript developers will laugh because what's wrong here is, but to a newbie, this is a Grand Canyon-like gap in understanding. The problem is this isn't JavaScript, it's jQuery. And many tutorial creators use frameworks and helper libraries to explain JavaScript basics. This is like teaching somebody English by first teaching them shorthand. It's insane. So the author has a point here. There are some videos that kind of make the assumption that you actually know what's going on, and the content creator doesn't also doesn't put into consideration the fact that you are a beginner, you don't know anything. For example, in this case where they use jQuery, but they don't really explain that they're actually using jQuery. I think this is kind of a problem that I also find with some tutorials, and I think some of you guys find it a problem in my tutorials where I explain a concept, but you can't really grasp like that concept. So let's go to how to overcome this. So you need to evaluate the sample code before you begin the course, book, blog, or whatever you're starting. Look at what's imported and required in the JavaScript file. If you're seeing something like this at the top of the JavaScript file. So the author gives an example here. So we can have import default export from module name and the other kinds of imports in JavaScript. So I kind of see like he gave a really nice point here. It's good to see the code, but this is something that can be hard for someone who is just starting. I mean, you just can't come out of anywhere and be like you're going to read code from a book and yet you don't know what the code actually does. So this may happen for someone who has an idea about how JavaScript works, but I don't really think a beginner can be able to basically go ahead and do this. They may need some sort of guidance in a way. So then stay away clearly. This person knows how to code but does not know how to teach. Those are two different things. Yeah, there are a lot of programming teachers online. There are people like me, there are people like Traversy Media, there are people like DevEd. They are very interesting teachers, and all these teachers have different styles of teaching. So what do you have to do, in my opinion, is check out all of the content creators on the internet, all the people who teach programming concepts on the internet. And once you realize that the person teaches in a style you want and you can be able to understand, then go for it. Because sometimes content creators may not have the person watching their video in mind. Sometimes they may create a tutorial for a beginner, and sometimes they may create a tutorial that's not for a beginner. But either way, it's good to check out all the content creators and be able to select, because there's a wild pool of programming content out there. Also, knowing the differences between JavaScript and its libraries and frameworks can help you differentiate between the two, which all the expert instructors blend together. So they give a link here, differences between JavaScript and other helper libraries. I think this is kind of useful because it kind of confuses everyone. For example, the example he actually gave. So knowing the frameworks, so here it gives actually a very good blog link to the new relic blog. And let's go to reason number 4. So reason number 4 is running code before you can code. Actually, he's saying running before you can walk. Everybody wants to build something amazing from the get-go. And honestly speaking, I've also been part of the people who are falling into this trap where you actually need to first build a project without having to understand what is actually happening. You are following a tutorial so that you can have a project at the end of it, but you don't know what is exactly happening. So everybody wants to build something amazing from the get-go, so they fire up a React, Angular, etc. tutorial to get started. Cause those things look amazing. Actually, cause those things look amazing. I think every beginner faces some part of this, because you get to a point where you feel like building this app will help you understand this. You'll see something like build an Instagram clone, build a Facebook clone, build this clone, build Amazon 2.0 on the internet, and you think that will actually teach you React. Then you follow through the entire tutorial and you get to the end having it the way it works, but you haven't really understood anything. So I think I kind of relate to what the author is speaking. So let's go ahead. You should never learn a framework first and a language second. It's ridiculous. I think he has a point here, but a lot of developers try this, get frustrated, cold feet, and then quit. Then they blame JavaScript for their failure. That's to them. So I really think the author has a point here. Personally, I tried to do the same thing, try to build something in React, but you don't actually understand JavaScript as a programming language. And I think the author is actually going to tell us that being able to understand how JavaScript works plays a very huge role in us to being able to understand what tutorials are really about, or being able to understand how to build stuff with JavaScript. So let's go ahead and read how to overcome. So learn to walk before you can run. Start your JavaScript adventure with Vanilla.js, which is actually right. Plain JavaScript. Actually, Vanilla.js is plain JavaScript. And learn the basics before you can leap into advanced realms. Even if you're an awesome Java, PHP, C++, or whatever, you need to learn the basics before moving on to advanced tasks. Vanilla.js started as a kind of backlash joke against the overwrought JavaScript frameworks that were choking the internet. Now it's becoming an actual back to basics movement, which is a fantastic way to learn JavaScript. So he actually gives some really interesting vanilla JavaScript resources like Snipcat, Learn Vanilla.js, and JavaScript for Web Developers, which is a fantastic soup to nuts Vanilla.js resource. So you can check this out if you really need to learn Vanilla.js. And let's actually get into the final thoughts of the author. So, final thoughts. Often in life and learning, it's not the complexities of the task that cause us to stumble. It's the stupid little things that knock us off course. And The journey to learn JavaScript is filled with very many stupid little things. Hopefully, I've captured the key to help you streamline your learning. Remember too that everybody lies. People who say they got started with JavaScript and are back in 4 months' time are all lying. It took them years to learn these skills. Trust me, don't feel bad if you don't get it in 4 months or even 6 or even longer. Everybody learns at their own pace and nothing is wrong with that. And remember, the hardest part of any journey are the first steps. Once you surmount those, the going gets easier and easier. Good luck, good learning, and good programming. Well, to be honest, this has been a very interesting post. So what have we got from here? So I'm going to be giving my opinion and wrapping up this video. So let's go back to point one. Point one was nightmare syntax. I think the most obvious way to get used to JavaScript syntax is by writing more JavaScript. Number two is the censored word and then code. So here I think it's the same thing. As long as it's code, syntax, and stuff like that, the only way to get used to writing JavaScript or building projects with JavaScript is by really practicing JavaScript, doing code challenges in JavaScript and stuff like that. Then reason number three was tutorials are made by experts. This is partially wrong and this is partially right. You may find tutorials for beginners explained by experts who really understand how to do the teaching, and they really do the job well, and they help a beginner. They work with a beginner hand in hand and help them to actually understand the concepts. So reason number four is all about running before you can walk, and I think this is like the biggest and best reason as to why people find it hard to learn JavaScript. So my personal opinion about this whole post is, for us to be able to learn JavaScript, what we need to actually do is to grasp the basics. For example, learn vanilla JS before you actually go for a front-end framework like React or Angular or Vue. And I think that can actually help us to become better JavaScript developers. I'm not an expert in JavaScript, but I really understand and really relate to most of the points mentioned in this post, and I hope you do as well. If you liked this video and you want me to make content based on the random things that I read about programming on the net, please consider liking this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and without any waste of time, see you in the next video. Bye.